In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Ali Mears.
And I'm Bing Giroux.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
The Honourable Greg Rickford was first elected to the Ontario Legislature as the MPP for Kenorra Rainy River in 2018 and re-elected in 2022 and 2025. Over the past 7 years, he has been Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Chairman of the Cabinet Committee for Economic and Resource Policy. In June 2024, his portfolio was expanded to include the Minister of First Nations Economic Reconciliation, and in March 2025, additional responsibility was added as Minister responsible for Ring of Fire economic and community partnerships. Minister Rickford also served Premier Ford as the Minister of Northern Development and Chair of the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund, Minister of Energy and the Minister of Mines and the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry, in addition to his current portfolios. Minister Rickford's academic and professional journey has been an interesting one, a lifelong learning plan focused on the pursuit of excellence in advocacy, spanning 3 careers that include nursing, the practice of law, and politics. We'll touch more on that later. Minister Rickford has a diploma in nursing from Mohawk College, a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of Victoria, specializing in community health nursing. The minister's nursing careers included working in municipal and specialized clinical settings in hospitals throughout North America and close to a decade working in northern isolated Indigenous communities across Canada. He has an MBA from the University of Laval, as well as a Bachelor of Common Law and Civil Law from McGill University. His law practice focused on Indigenous matters, including being a signatory of the Indian Residential School Agreement, Indigenous government, economic, and health opportunities. From 2008 to 2015, Minister Rickford served as the Federal Member of Parliament for Kenorra. During that time, he served Prime Minister Harper as the Parliamentary Secretary for Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, Minister of State for Science and Technology, Minister responsible for the Federal Economic Development Initiative for Northern Ontario, and finally, and how we know you best, as Canada's Minister of Natural Resources. That said, the most important job he has ever had is being a father to his 2 daughters. Minister, what an intro. Welcome.
I think it means I spent a lot of time in school.
You went to UVic. I did some time at UVic. So.
It's a great school. I miss BC and the Lower Mainland and the islands so much. I mean, just being back here.
Maybe you, like everyone in Canada, will retire to Victoria then.
Yeah, maybe.
We actually
a lot of ex-cabinet ministers from other provinces.
We do. Yeah, I think a few that just served Trudeau are back in Victoria and the island now, kind of hiding out over there. But we kind of want to start with your background. Actually, you were a registered nurse in remote Indigenous communities, and you also have legal training. It's very unique. So, can you tell us a bit more about your transition from nurse to lawyer to now politician?
Yeah, Ali, well, first, thank you for having me in this podcast, and we're going to put this out on our social media platforms because what you're doing is exciting. You and Bing, I appreciate the opportunity. Look, I've been asked this question a number of times, and I don't want to really sound too polished in my response, but really just say, simply put, that a central tenet of all 3 of those professions is really advocacy. The emotional intelligence that you build as a nurse, and certainly there's a lot of other things involved in that great profession. But the most important thing you do is advocate for people when they are likely at one of their more vulnerable places in life, an illness or some kind of condition, be it an accident or what have you. And so making the transition into the legal profession and then politics was really sort of a natural evolution. If you think about it, from my perspective, it just meant continuing to excel in the pursuit of advocacy and watching it take different forms. And it's been a tremendous journey, and it's been a great opportunity. And primarily, I should say, Ali, has coalesced around working with First Nations people and living in their communities. And I don't think that anybody could be more blessed in some respects than I have been to have those opportunities. And it started with nursing and really just followed in law and then in politics.
I'm thinking that going from being a nurse to going to law school is maybe you brought some soul with you that that law school doesn't always offer.
I think, I remember, talking to one of the professors when I got there, and she said, like, it is really good to have people from the caring professions. Not that lawyers don't care, but it can be, a little bit clinical and sort of not as
Adversarial even.
Adversarial. So adding that element to it was. And there was also another important trend, because frankly, I don't want to overstate my legal career. I've done some things I think of some significance, but I've only practiced law somewhere in and around 4 to 5 years total. Takes 10,000 hours to be considered an expert in something, I think, by most objective standards, and I'm not sure I got there. But there was a trend in law school as well that came with the class that I went in, where people went to law school and came out with no intention of practicing the law.
Ooh.
And just being a great, a stealth advocate with real, refined world-class legal training and thinking, and bringing it to other professions, applying it to other roles that were not strictly confined in the black letter law that people often think of when they think about a lawyer. So, I was able to, I've used my legal training for a lot more non-legal things than I have in practice. And I always tell young people, now that I'm not young, I guess, that
I get told this all the time.
It's never going to be a mistake to go to law school. Like any other profession, and get to the end of it and say, I think I'd like to do something else, but have a valuable skill set.
When you practiced law for those 4 or 5 years, did you go back to First Nations communities to practice law?
Yeah, it was exclusively. We built. I did things that I wanted to do. I had lived and worked in Pikangikum First Nation as the nurse in charge there. I'd worked as a nurse in the nursing station before becoming the nurse in charge, and they had their own ideas about how to run healthcare in the community. And when I came back, I have a lot of good friends there. I said, boy, we should build a health authority and incorporate it and start to broaden our relationships, make them more focused on bringing services to the community where you have your best chance at success. I also was extremely fortunate. First Nations Family Physician Health Services out of Sioux Lookout were, again, the communities that comprised that organization were ones that I'd worked in as a nurse and had extraordinary relationships with the chiefs. So that's the kind of stuff that I developed in the time that I did work as a lawyer, and kind of did it on my own terms in terms of the things that I wanted to pursue, but also had the opportunity to leverage relationships that I had developed as a nurse working and living in First Nations communities.
So we're going to take that and pivot to infrastructure and major projects in the natural resource sector. You've navigated some really contentious infrastructure debates in Canada at the federal cabinet, also related to Ring of Fire. So going through all that, what would you say are your criteria for success or failure for a project? If you were an advocate or you were advising somebody as a lawyer to run a major project, what are the benchmarks of success and failure?
Well, I think that the benchmarks for success, and there's obviously a story behind this, but you mentioned the Northern Gateway. Let me just preface anything I say by the fact that one of the stories that did not get told well enough in Northern Gateway were the fact that there were 42 First Nations that took up equity partnerships and positions in that pipeline, and it was a good project. And what are we doing today? We're talking about building something akin to it. And so I was left with a stinging view that, and this has some application to the Ring of Fire, that we had an obligation to give a voice to First Nation communities who wanted to develop and advance projects and that their voice would be heard as well, if not more than voices that at least on the surface appear to object for a variety of reasons. And I'm not dismissing the reasons that they may reject them or oppose them. Had typically been given, a fairly generous range in the public, in the media, to get their opinions across. But in fairness to that group and to the ones who want to do advanced projects, and I spoke about this morning, and I know, it was a key part of the discussion on the panel is around legacy infrastructure, right? Like, if I think of the Ring of Fire or any other major critical mineral project or even forestry project that's on the horizon in Ontario, their characteristics are that they're entering parts of Ontario where there's very brittle infrastructure. And the way that I think we build consensus and ultimately move towards consent, which is a word that's being discussed in a variety of different ways, is to find common ground on the things that are priorities for governments, whether they're First Nations, provincial, federal, and in the case of, for the Ring of Fire, municipal, right? Inadequate electricity to the communities in the southern part of Northern Ontario, folks, and none farther north, right? Like the Ring of Fire, for example, the 5 or 6 communities most proximal to it are still on diesel generation, and they're the only communities left in Ontario that are on diesel generation. We all want that to change. That's a common consensus item that I think is worth developing. Road access, all-season road access, is now something that First Nations are talking about in Northern Ontario. It's 800,000 square kilometers, Northern Ontario. That's a very big territory.
I know we always say, oh yeah, we're in Northern Ontario, but we're actually not really in Northern Ontario.
Yeah.
We're just in Middle Ontario, but you can't travel to the north, which a lot of people don't understand.
Well, in Northern Ontario, I like to say, people say, we're in Northern Ontario. A couple hours later, they're driving, we're in Northern Ontario. A couple hours later, we're still in Northern Ontario. And I tell people that if you're living in Toronto, it's faster to get to Jacksonville, Florida than it is my house in Kenorra. But anyways, just to finish that point, there are a number of instances in projects across the north, potential projects in Northern Ontario, where the discussion is as much about infrastructure and serving those communities, whether it's road, broadband, electricity, and what have you, where we find common ground and we have really good conversations, because that's what governments should be talking about. We don't build mines, Ali. We don't build, we're not forest operators. We create the conditions for the kind of economic prosperity that that governments should be in the business of doing, as opposed to talking about how we could build a mine. We're not experts.
That's interesting. I read a couple of years ago a World Bank report, and it talked about large-scale infrastructure like you're referring to, and it said those large-scale infrastructure projects, whether they're roads or power lines or what have you, raise all boats, like in terms of lessening poverty, but they must have off-ramps. That highway has to have an off-ramp to the town. There needs to be a electrical connection to the town. Those off-ramps are the critical.
Well, Bing, you would remember this, very early on in my federal career. Cliffs was the, essentially had the lion's share of the claims in and around what we call the Ring of Fire. And they wanted a P3 road to be built that nobody else could access except them for the purposes of their, I said, well, that's not P3, that's P1, right? You get to use a road we would likely build. Right. And so that's not on. And, they had some parting shots, like this will never go ahead and what have you. But good riddance, in my respectful view. Whoa, controversy on the podcast. But you
have to start swearing before it gets controversial.
Okay, yeah, all right. I do have a potty mouth, but I won't use it today. The heart and soul of where this has really moved quickly, especially in the past year, have been through items of consensus and really in a very enriched way, talking about things like all-season roads and access to clean, green electricity for isolated communities. And the final piece I would just say, and this takes us back to Northern Gateway and some of the lessons that I've learned, is that if economic partnerships and community partnerships can define the future of major project development and not so major project development, particularly in the far-reaching northern parts of Ontario, they'll be defined and they'll only be successful with First Nations as full partners.
I love
Period.
that. Yeah, and it's good advice to our listeners too, because you really address that for major projects to succeed, really the only criteria ought to be that we are working to the benefit of communities and what their needs are, which, Bing and I know from working on many of these agreements often aren't the same as what the proponents' outcomes are.
No.
Building a mine or an LNG facility or harvesting timber might be what the proponent wants to do, but maybe building roads or an ice rink or a hospital is what the community wants.
But they needn't be in conflict.
No, and look, we were on a panel this morning with Canada Nickel, and I've had plenty of dealings, obviously, with Wailu, who has a considerable stake in Eagle's Nest, and the kind of the epicenter of the Esker site, known as the Ring of Fire, and Ali, you my friend JP Gladue, we talk openly about how two of us have built our careers on fairly frank discussions with proponents, and neither one of us are afraid to tell it like it is. And I've said to some of those companies, look, you need to do what you do, right? What do? You build mines. We will work to create the conditions. In the same way, I would speak to my cabinet colleagues and say, I'm reminding you that we don't actually build mines. We create the conditions so that there's the potential for this. And when we did that, for example, in the Ring of Fire or farther out in northwestern Ontario for the Frontier Lithium's project, and most notably with Canada Nickel's recent announcement as a major project, we spent our time doing what governments should be doing, and that is supporting partnerships, be they economic or communities, focusing on their priorities, and then getting out of the way so that those communities could be successful partners in business. And I think this was a key thing that we heard from Indigenous leadership over and over again, especially even when it came to legislation like Bill 5 and the Bill 5 federal one, is that we hope this doesn't get in the way of our ability to form business partnerships with real companies that do that work. So I don't want to get astray of the original point, but at the end of the day, let's make sure we're doing what we're good at doing and what we're intended to do.
There's a reason there's a private sector and there's a government.
That's right. That's right. That's
who's best equipped to manage that risk best. Which I think takes us to our next question. So we'll talk a little about C5 and one process, one project. You and I were around when the feds did the MPMO back under Harper's administration. So this isn't the first time this thing's been given a kick. So I'm sure you've learned some lessons with those things. But what's the shift? Like, what did this do? What was the strategic shift that this required, and what is it allowing you to do?
Well, wow. I mean, history repeats itself, especially if it's a hell of a good idea. I did kind of use a cuss word. I'm sorry. Look, Prime Minister Harper had some thoughts that I think I can share with folks on the podcast. Like, he would say, why, I remember when we had the Idle No More and Attawapiskat, their particular stand, it was absurd that you would have a world-class diamond mine 40 to 50 kilometers from a community living in an unacceptable level of poverty, and that can't go on anymore, right? And increasingly, if you were seeing where the puck was headed, not where it's been, which Prime Minister Harper was exceptionally good at doing, taking a lot of the ideology out of it and moving forward with, notions of in their very early form, getting rid of redundancy and overlapping regulatory pieces. We had an interesting situation with Marten Falls as we, finalized the community partnership agreement that we just announced, where some of the obligations in that agreement, particularly for Marten Falls, were unattainable because they had obligations to a federal regulatory process that we were already doing. And they were, frankly, because they led the environmental assessment for the Northern Road and the community access road. So they were around, and then we had a pause. We hit as Canadians, in my respectful view, we hit a brick wall. And yes, I'll be a little bit partisan in this. It comes with inviting a politician on board. We got into an ideological government that canceled Northern Gateway based on pure, opinions and ideology as opposed to fact, and proceeded with the kinds of pursuits that benefited nobody in the end, including and especially First Nations communities. They've said that, especially now as you've got a prime minister of the same political stripe, but thinking a lot more practically and pragmatically about how things should go. And Bing, what do we have? I mean, one process, one approval is exactly the kinds of things we were talking about in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, when some of the fairly major architecture was changed to try to pursue that kind of thing. So I think we're right back where we were, but we're calling it different things, and it appears as though we have alignment with governments. And I know you guys you want to get to some of the, and rightly so, Bill C-5 and some of the controversy around it. Let me tell you a little secret that some of the elements of Bill C-5, the uptake for how it could apply, so special economic zones, for example, are actually being asked by First Nation communities and First Nations businesses more than they are any other, like, partners. First Nations are partners, so I don't want to call them stakeholders, but other stakeholders who would say, wait, we're doing this project, whether it's nuclear or what have you. All of a sudden, this is a conversation about First Nations communities and or their businesses leading the way. And that's pretty exciting. And it's not getting the airplay that
yeah, I don't think I've read very much, a little, about First Nations being the ones taking advantage of these pieces of legislation.
Well, first of all, it's in the end stages of the consultation. Obviously, there's thoughts and opinions on whether the consultation is sufficient enough. That will play itself out. But there's still a very serious technical requirement to consult on the implementation of the bill, should it apply to any part. So nobody's abandoning that. We followed the court law, if you will, in terms of our responsibilities, our ability to bring legislation to the fore, to have it go through committee, and then to take it out to consultation. But I'm telling you right now, you heard it on this podcast, that the uptake from First Nations communities and businesses is very promising.
Well, and I think there's elements of Bill 5 in Ontario and federally, and also Bill 15 and 16 in BC, where nations, especially on the municipal side, I think we just talked about overlap. And when you think of overlap between the province, municipalities, what First Nations are doing in terms of leading environmental assessments, leading regulatory frameworks, there is an incredible amount of overlap. So I'm not totally surprised that nations are saying, hey, this is actually going to work for us in a way maybe we didn't think of when this first came out. And of course, we have this podcast, Minister, for the very reason that these stories don't get told, because our media is completely inundated by the worst possible case scenario and all the people that are very loud. And it's important that we can tell some of these maybe softer stories. Yeah,
I totally agree with that sentiment. I think that one of the, well, how about I ask you guys a question? Because you're asking me. How many consultations do you think the province of Ontario is involved with right now with First Nations in Ontario? Obviously,
we're on the Price is Right, Minister
Rickford
style.
So take a guess. You've got 133 nations.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say 133.
Oh gosh, how many consultations? So that's individual projects.
Formal duties to consult on anything from
2,700.
over 8,000. And
I
that's
combine
just the province of
$1.
Ontario. I guess you won, Ali, but let me be perfectly clear. Some of those communities are involved in 70 to 80 different consultations on different projects or different things that municipal, provincial, and federal governments do. I mean, one of the important pieces of work that I'm doing, Ali, is, and this is a precursor really to Bill C5, is listening to First Nations who are saying, we are under siege with this consultation.
fatigue.
One process and one project, one approval is actually a better way to go, providing the fundamental principles of the duty to consult and anything that evolves from it. For example, accommodation, community partnerships, economic partnerships, agreements, and what have you, start to be streamlined, because we're talking about communities, some of them with populations of 80 to 150 people.
We see it all the time in British Columbia as well. I mean, we'll be negotiating a participation agreement or an impact benefit agreement with one nation, and they'll say to us, we have 9 other projects just in this sector that we're negotiating other agreements with. So really apologize for taking some time to get back to you. I mean, that's one example of one nation on one file we're working on.
There's a chief coming in this afternoon we're helping him streamline his approval system because he's tired of looking at all these referrals.
I have, unpacked some, because of the relationships I've had with First Nation political leaders over the course of time, when they weren't political leaders and they were, working in the community as I was as a nurse, for example, share with me, that once they became political leaders in their communities, it caught them off guard how much work they would have to do from their phone or from their iPhone or what have you, directly dealing with things like consultation, and admit, like we're not experts in consultation. We don't have capacity to deal with all of these at one time, especially for some of the more sophisticated things that could really impact, perhaps favorably, mostly I would like to think favorably, because it just becomes overwhelming. In short, you can never make an assumption that the community has even a person responsible by job title for things like consultation. Yeah. And we've been working to fix that, and streamlining is one of the ways that I think we have to do that.
Well, I appreciate that, and we're definitely supportive of that. We've been brought on to some larger infrastructure projects where the first advice we give clients is we need to start streamlining this and batching, permits for nations and making sure that it's very clear how we can move through this in a good way.
Well, I think the first question, Ali, and you guys do great work, is sometimes to go into the community and say, we'd like to understand all of the sort of consultation and engagement you have with, because that's only the provincial government. Imagine some of those communities actually have consultation obligations, because it is an obligation. It's not just a right. A right always has a corresponding obligation if it's going to be successful and done successfully. Is just for context, if nothing else, to understand just exactly how many different things that they're involved with, because that will ultimately affect their ability to prioritize the project that you're engaging them with, or representing them with, or bringing to them.
Absolutely. I want to pivot a bit. We'd love to talk a bit more about the Ring of Fire,
right,
but I want to take a step back. I mean, obviously there was just this really exciting agreement signed with Marten Falls. Congratulations on that, and to your team. But I want to take a step back. Can you just explain to us and our listeners, what is the Ring of Fire? What does it look like? What's the geography like up there? What is the opportunity like in Ontario for this massive infrastructure? And what has the process been like? Maybe if you can start, maybe over the last...
What's the difference between that and Johnny Cash's?
Yeah.
Got to be getting close to Christmas.
Might have had some similarities to some of the chorus or verses that he sang. It doesn't anymore. It's starting to feel and look a lot more like a legacy opportunity. The Ring of Fire is, in short, in my view, based on the data that I've read, and I sat corporately with a company that had most of the claims, particularly at the Esker site, known as the sort of the heart and soul of the Ring of Fire. It is the most exquisite, quantitatively and qualitatively profile of critical minerals the world over. In some categories, some of the critical minerals a 250-year supply. Like, it's phenomenal. The nickel is amongst, if not the highest grade in the world. So it's real. And there isn't, in at least to our knowledge, another location in the world where you could have such a small mining footprint. Because don't forget, some people think this is massive. Like, it's all like, oftentimes we think of, oil and gas in Alberta. It's not actually. The Esker site is barely a square kilometer, and the intention of the first and probably foreseeable portal into this mineral-rich zone, it's all underground, and it's not very big.
So it's Northern Ontario?
It's
Northern Ontario, Northeast Ontario.
It is in the central part of Northern Ontario, and for folks, I know we're here in British Columbia, but I would say if you think of the distance between Toronto and Montreal, roughly 400 to 500 kilometers, to the primary site, and then there are other very encouraging ones farther north.
And is it a ring?
It actually looks like a ring. If you for folks here, I wish I kind of had a map here to show you, but it on a heat map, or if you take a look at the most modern technology that analyzes and color and codifies the different minerals that are there, it is actually a ring.
And there's nickel and what other minerals?
Nearly the entire platinum series.
Okay.
So you're talking, and also a very attractive precious metal profile, gold.
Wow.
Which is kind of an interesting subject matter, because gold at $6,000 an ounce might be one of the things nobody's talking about as to a reason why critical minerals have been so hard to develop, particularly in Northern Ontario.
But it also could make a polymetallic project more worthwhile.
For sure, right? Because it has anchor tenant value, if you will, if that's the right phrase. But
And what did the road look like, Minister, 20 years ago? What infrastructure is in place?
There
what
isn't one.
infrastructure needs to be in place?
The communities don't have, that are most proximal to it, are still on diesel generation. If there's a road network, it's more east-west, so not the corridor to prosperity that we've defined and called in partnership with First Nations. And it has to be built. And it can provide the access to services, economic, health, social programming and services that they frankly have had very limited to, if any, access with. So I think the other important thing, Ali, is that the northern roads that have been in place during the winter only, because they traverse lakes, etc., are shrinking dramatically. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast, but First Nations communities are coming to governments and saying, look, like, we're down to a couple of weeks
For ice roads.
winter for ice roads. You call them ice roads, the truckers and all that. Like, we need to get working on this now. And that's where I think we have an alignment on consensus projects like building the road. So politicians can, I wasn't supposed to tap the table. I'm sorry.
We'll forgive you.
Sorry, sound guys. We are having serious conversations about developing those corridors, because they're going to be required for a host of other reasons.
Amazing.
So we're going to tear this apart. $62 million investment in the corridor, $3.1 billion Indigenous partnership financing. What do you see coming out of this from an economic perspective? Like, do you have sort of a projection of what this could mean for Ontario and for Canada?
Well, if it means anything, it means that these projects cannot proceed until or unless there are meaningful, substantive economic and community partnership agreements with government and with private sector, as you had framed and thought of it earlier. or they will not, cannot, and should not proceed. And we were talking today about Canada Nickel and the hard work that they did, because frankly, we were talking this morning, I was like, folks, you should know that 4 or 5 years ago, this was not on our radar screen. It was actually defined and found its place on the major project list because of the work that they did with First Nations communities.
Right. They have a First Nations equity deal.
They have an equity position, and it's exceptional. And we haven't even been involved in it yet. We've been more involved with Chief Archibald's community needs to have capacity to be able to proceed with this project. Similar ones across the north. But when it comes to the isolated parts of Northern Ontario, it's very clear that whether it's forestry and more predominantly the discussion around critical minerals, legacy infrastructure is what is going to be required to support it, but also for the modern way that isolated First Nations communities are choosing to live and see the future.
So when can you get this thing done? When can you get this road built? I mean, that's, we're all talking now about
we
stuff
start
done.
construction officially on all access points of the to the Ring of Fire and connecting those communities starting next spring.
Oh, great.
By late August, folks need to know that those roads will be built. And there's another important development, and that is an option for an east-west road that hooks up with Pickle Lake. I don't want to give people the geographic details of Northern Ontario, but it's the farthest north that the blacktop goes, so to speak. And it has industrial and commercial capacity built in because there's a mine there already, Musselwhite Dam, or Musselwhite mine. It's been around for quite a long time, precious metal gold operation. And so that will connect another 4 or 5 communities who've been talking about road access for as long as I've been working up there as a nurse and lawyer and now politician. And Bing, that happens to be a long time now because I'm older.
You got great hair though.
Yeah.
What took so long in your opinion to get to this point? I mean, this road has been talked about for many years, and what was kind of the process to get to where we are today?
I think we have already mentioned the shrinking winter road, the desire for communities to move towards all season road access, the need to electrify the isolated communities with cleaner, greener, and more reliable electricity. Nobody thinks diesel generation is a good idea. Unfortunately, we're still going to have to build out some diesel generation capacity in the existing communities that are not tied to Watay Power farther west. So we're kind of, it's kind of lining up really well. Again, I have to be a little bit partisan. There was a decade of darkness from the previous provincial government who, in my respectful view, had very little desire to actually develop the Ring of Fire and focused on, an agreement for a framework, to have a framework agreement that would agree to
we actually
have a framework.
Don't use the word framework agreement around here.
Thank you. It's almost a potty mouth word because it accomplished nothing, and communities will tell you that. And so, our current approach with these community partnership agreements, we've taken some criticism, and it's fair enough. Yet, that we're going to, working with individual communities as opposed to they came to us and said, this is what we want and how we see our future. Let's talk turkey and let's get these friggin' projects. We're getting close to bad language here on this podcast. I'm sorry. Underway already.
We always get them there somehow.
Okay.
Can you tell us more about that Marten Falls agreement that you just signed as an example of one of the agreements that you've got in place?
Well, the Webequie and Marten Falls First Nation agreements, which have roughly the same initial value, have 2 distinct features. They focus on community priorities that they require to build the infrastructure that more specifically the roads, road access, and things that people don't talk enough about but came to the fore through these agreements. We need community space, so recreational facilities that could be multi-purpose buildings for training, daycare, for this, because as I said to, both chiefs, I said, there's a lot in the line here, guys, because you have to build these roads, and you are ultimately going to be responsible for, the mega infrastructure projects that we're talking about, because labor is at a premium right now. I talked about the gold mines in Ontario. The Prime Minister is saying we're going to do this project, and we're going to take skilled trades that are transportable, but are going to be used up very quickly. So those communities are going to carry the weight of mobilizing their own membership to build them, or they're not going to be built. That's the next biggest, if I don't like to talk in barriers or issues, but that's the next biggest challenge we have. And I said to the Premier and his team, and spoke openly with the chiefs, that these agreements were ultimately going to be contingent upon our success as building out training funds and programs. Otherwise, they run the risk of not being built, or certainly not being built on the timeline. So we've got a great start. Finally, Ali, to your inquiry about the extensive amount of time has taken, but that's the next big frontier.
So barriers, like what could kill this? What could stop it? Like we've seen a lot of projects. We talked about some already in this country that got close but didn't get the whole way. Yeah,
I think labor. Skilled workforce is going to be is probably the single biggest thing that I see. There obviously there's more work for the governments to be doing, and likely at some point the mining companies, if you will, with some communities who are still very reluctant, if that's the right word, and maybe opposed. But
further along, though, where the actual mine sites are.
Right.
So right now we're talking about two nations, Marten Falls and Webequie, who
Right.
are most impacted by the actual Ring of Fire road.
That's right.
But at the end of the road, or around the ring of the road where the mines are, there is some opposition to mining projects.
You know what? If you unpack it and you talk with leadership in the area long enough, the conversation has finally come to a place where it's completely understandable that their concerns would be the legacy infrastructure required to support that activity is actually bigger and more impactful than the mine site. Mm-hmm. Let's talk here, folks. Mm-hmm. I said a square kilometer and a couple hundred workers. Building a corridor through, that part of Northern Ontario, real northern, far north Ontario, is more impactful in a lot of ways than the actual mine site itself. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that, right? Like those communities, this is a carbon sink. The James Bay lowlands are without question are global in scale in terms of its contributions to, treating and dealing with carbon, just letting nature take its course. So nobody has an interest in tampering with that per se. We have to build this corridor responsibly. And that's mm-hmm. why for one of the first steps we took was to ensure that First Nations led the environmental assessments. And now we're having very good conversations. I caught it today here in British Columbia about Indigenous environmental processes.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bing actually was at the helm of the first ever Indigenous-led environmental assessment.
The Squamish Nation was at the helm. I was along for the ride.
Yeah.
Willing partners helped. So. Yeah. But, we talk about legacy and things left over, and I just want to drop this point because I was at a conference yesterday. So Tall-10, it's our sort of golden triangle, they call it. So that's our version of the Ring of Fire here in British Columbia. The Tall-10 Nation have embraced some projects, other projects they challenge. But I was told, and this data is probably a little old, but I was told by a member of the nation that they don't have one kid in care. They don't have one kid in care. That's the legacy of effective mining jobs and infrastructure. Right. They've got the power line, they've got the roads, they've got these mines. They don't have one kid. Maybe there may be children that I think are with relatives. I don't want to oversplice that, but not one kid in care. That's the legacy of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, this is about dramatically changing the economic fortunes of a community. And we don't talk about it enough. It's being given a voice more recently from every provincial government and the federal government, but more importantly, First Nations communities, especially the ones that have signed these partnership agreements. And that is that good paying jobs and families are entirely consistent with what First Nations have always conceived of. And I should say that the government's role in a lot of this, being in my respectful view, is being there to write the next important chapter of reconciliation from 30,000 feet right down to the report itself, and that is economic reconciliation. It's why Premier Ford stylized my ministry a couple of years ago. He became acutely aware of the discrepancy between what we thought of prosperity and some of its assumptions, and what First Nations communities, especially ones in the isolated parts of Northern Ontario, were living under, and that has to change. And with that, I think you get down into positive signals that less children are in care and more people are working. They tend to correspond. Yeah.
Maybe with that, Minister, one last question is actually looking for your opinion.
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot on our podcast this last year about Canada as an energy superpower. And,
Right.
Obviously our neighbor down south has really, I think, opened this small window of a lot of Canadians really understanding the significance of our natural resource sector in Canada that perhaps they didn't a year and a half ago.
10 minutes ago.
10 minutes ago, last January. So with that, what do you think needs to really happen federally and in Ontario and other to establish Canada as an energy superpower? Big question.
I think, and this is just my opinion because you asked for it, I think that the most important thing is that we ensure our own communities in our own country have access to the notion that we are an energy superpower. It cannot make any sense in my mind, and it's not a big one, but it's big enough. You can't go out on the world stage and say, "Hey, man, we got oil, gas, electricity for everybody. Come get it." And we've seen how everybody, Trump and the gang, they'll talk tariffs until it comes to oil and gas because we need it. But we have too many First Nation communities still that have very brittle access to the kind of energy that a country who wants to talk about being an energy superpower could have. And so I think for the province of Ontario, it's ensuring that they have equity partnerships. They are built in. They are automatic. Any new transmission corridors, Ali, you would know this in the work that you've been a part of in your own career, are in place. 25% is the floor, and it can be as high as the communities that are being impacted by it. Impacted in the sense that some First Nation communities have sponsored corridors because it serves their own corridor, not just Southern Ontario, for example, and some of the new requirements. So that's the first thing, Bing. The second thing I would say is that the projects have to have a primary complexion of real First Nations partnership, economic and community level. And I can't think of a project anywhere in this country, whether it's a pipeline across to Eastern Canada and port and beyond, or Western Canada, or transmission corridors that go to support responsible resource development within a province or as they may traverse provinces and territories, that will require the full participation and position of the First Nation that they should advance. Was that a word salad?
I loved it.
Well,
Love
two
that
things
word
that work
salad.
really well together. The natural resources are removable, so you can't export those jobs. And the First Nations have been here forever, so those two things work really well together.
Yeah, well, this is about alignment, right? And on things that we can get in the room together and agree on. And then some of the more difficult conversations, for example, a specific project, a specific site, what have you, especially when it comes to mining, tends to go better when the confidence, trust, and alignment, I've used that word a lot today, I'm sorry, but it matters around their priorities. And frankly, to take this right back to my own time, early times as a politician, that we do not build our projects at the expense of First Nations and their traditional lands that they traverse.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nations, Indigenous communities need to feel not only like they are a part of the project, but that their own nations are being lifted up by the project in order for it to be able to proceed.
And I think that in the current context of things like free, prior, and informed consent, and what the federal government and BC are starting, trying to do, it hasn't had a whole lot of impact yet. And Ontario is still working on a consensus-driven model that, gives a fair voice to everybody, everybody's stake in a given development. And we think that's at least for now, a better way to proceed. And then we can get into the discussion more granular about why, if, or how a project should develop and what First Nations interests or concerns are. And that's what's happening right now. And frankly, while some people think it's an issue, I think it's an opportunity.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Minister, for taking time
Great
out of your
conversation.
very busy day to come be on the Primary Risk podcast. We're very thankful to have you on, and thanks for being in BC today. Thank you to our audience for listening to today's podcast. I'm sure it's going to be our highest selling podcast yet.
I hope so.
Please follow us to receive notifications on upcoming episodes wherever you might get your podcast. Check out the show notes. Minister Rickford, he referenced a lot of Ontario projects today, so we'll make sure that those materials that were mentioned are in our footnotes. New episodes are going to be released monthly. We actually are recording another podcast next week to go over our top 5 project moments of 2025. It's going to be
Highs and
pretty
lows.
spicy. And we're just really excited to have everyone listening to this episode. So you can get it on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube.
I hope I'm back talking about projects that are really happening.
Yes,
So,
we
yeah.
will.
We do
We'll
too.
definitely have you back.
Absolutely, Minister. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.